So the plan for today is to continue on through ecological topics. We're going to finish off the biomes and then start the next topic of behavioral ecology. This is where we left off last time. We were considering, as we were going through some of the different biomes and considering how they differed from each other, we had just spent a few minutes getting used to the way in which the information about biomes is presented in your textbook, namely as graphs showing precipitation, the bottom graph here, and also temperature as a function of months. So on all of the graphs that we'll be looking at for the different biome diagrams, the x-axis will be month during the year, and the starting with January, so January, February, March, and so on. And then the two graphs are both with the same x-axis. So I pointed out that tropical forests are characterized by high and relatively constant temperatures, as shown here. Lots and lots of rain. It is seasonal, and one ends up with a habitat that looks like the picture on the right, where there was very dense foliage, lots of vertical stratification, meaning different layers within the canopy and at all different layers in the forest, which provides a very large number of different microhabitats where organisms can live, which leads to the very high levels of diversity in tropical forests. Now, as we discuss these biomes, I think it's also appropriate to spend a little time talking about the current status of these different biomes. And so the next figures I'm going to show you are concerned with loss of some of the tropical forest areas on the planet, and these next graphs are not from your textbook. So what you're looking at here is a graph where the x-axis is percentage of the forest lost. It's somewhat light gray, so it might be hard for you to see. Let's see, percent forest lost. And over here we have 0, meaning none was lost, and over here is 50% lost, and this is just the top 20 or so areas of the world. Most of these are countries, and so let's see, here's 20 right here, and so you can see that basically all of the individual countries that are showing up here for the most part have lost 20% or more of their total tropical forest in the area or during the 15 years 1990 through 2005 inclusive. And you can notice a couple of things here. One is that this is not just one continent. We've got Africa, Central and South America, Southeast Asia, all represented here, for example. Now, some of these countries are relatively small in terms of total acreage or square miles area, and so losing 50% may or may not be an actually large area. So if instead of looking at percent of the overall total for that particular country, if we then look at a different x-axis, which is actual area, this is the same data that are graphed in a different way. The x-axis is now just straight deforested area in terms of thousands of hectares, again, and for the same time region. And you now see one particular country, namely Brazil, which pulls out from the rest of the pack. Brazil is a huge country, and so it has lost a very, very large area of tropical forest. Brazil still has the largest continuous tropical forest of any other countries in the world. The area that it lost during this 15-year period or so is about the size of California, to give you an idea of how large that is. And but Brazil is so gigantic that in terms of percent, it's not even showing up on this list here. So, in terms of percent, it's not one of the top 20. But this is a huge loss of tropical forest in South America here. And there are some of the other countries again. All continents are represented. So if these tropical forests have been lost, well then, where do they go? What are they now? They are now been logged. They've been converted to agriculture, so they're no longer the natural tropical forests that they were before. So we'll return to this topic later when we talk a little bit about conservation. But let's go ahead now and go on to the next biome here. And I hope as you're reading about these different biomes that you look at the pictures and perhaps think about your own experiences as you've been to different parts of the world or the country, or maybe just even the state, where you've directly been able to experience some of these different areas, and think about how different the flora and fauna are as you travel through these different biomes, now that you know how these biomes are identified. So this next category here, this biome, is called the subtropical desert. What does subtropical mean? Where does that mean it is? Well, this is latitudinally dependent. This means approximately at 30 degrees north or 30 degrees south. And so what is the significance of that? Well, those are the areas where it's particularly dry, right, because of the Hadley cell convection that we discussed before, right? The warm air that rises at the equators, at the equator, and then dumps a lot of rain on those areas as the air is cooled, as it rises, and then we have condensation of the water vapor. And then that same air, which is now dry, then circulates in these huge patterns and these huge circulating cells, coming back down closer to the surface of the Earth at about 30 degrees north or 30 degrees south, making those areas extremely arid. And so that means that most of these deserts are in bands at about 30 degrees north and about 30 degrees south. So what are the characteristics then of the subtropical desert, now that we've considered where they are? Well, the precipitation, not surprisingly, is extremely low. Most of you are probably familiar with the area, with the idea that deserts, and of course we're quite close to 30 degrees north, it's extremely arid region around here. There's not a whole lot of rainfall. Temperature is seasonal. It can be quite, it's variable both at a seasonal level and also at a daily level, so it can be quite hot during the summer, but cooler during non-summer times, and there can also be cycles during the day. With regard to the vegetation, if you look at a typical desert scene here, you can see there's most of the vegetation is quite low. You don't tend to get lots of very large trees. You also get a lot of succulents that tend to be widely scattered, so you don't get very dense vegetation. Succulents, that may or may not be a word that you've heard of before. There it is, succulents. These are plants that have water storing tissues that makes them sort of squishy or bulbous, and so cactus are an example of this. Plural is cacti. So water storing tissues. These plants also have a very reduced leaf area. After all, the leaves are a point where a lot of water vapor a lot of water is lost from a plant as it turns into water vapor and evaporates away from the surfaces. So you see a lot of spines or very narrow leaves as well. Common desert animals, so that's the vegetation. How about the animals? Common desert animals, you might be familiar with some of them, snakes and spiders and scorpions and various kinds of rodents. And lizards, many of the desert animals show adaptations to water conservation, both in terms of their behavior and also in terms of their physiological adaptations. Okay, I think that's all that I want to say about deserts. Let's go ahead and move on to the next biome here, temperate grasslands. And first, let's consider what temperate means. Temperate actually has a couple of different meanings. Temperate means mild, which is certainly relevant in this context, but it also means something specific latitudinally. Temperate in this context of a biome means between the tropics and the polar regions. And so what does that mean? The tropics are between, about 23.5 degrees north and 23.5 degrees south, right? So between 23.5 degrees latitude, and the polar regions start at about 66.5 degrees or so. So within that range, more or less is what would be considered temperate. And you may notice the significance of the 66.5, right? That's 90.23.5, right? So this is the tilt of the Earth, right? And then this is the maximum, so this is what we have up at the pole. That's where that number comes from. So, temperate grasslands. These have a number of different kinds of names depending on where they are on the planet. So you may be familiar with terms such as prairie. This is a word used in North America. You may have seen the word pampas, which is a word used in South America. You may have seen the word steppes. This is Eurasian, or veldts, African. All of these words then refer to, are used to describe temperate grasslands in different kinds of areas of the world. So what are the characteristics? Much more water. You can see that from the precipitation graph down here at the bottom. Here, much more rainfall than you see in the deserts. But it is still not enough water to support a full forest. That is one of the differences between grasslands and forests, is that forests require more precipitation than one typically sees in the grasslands. It's also seasonal, with more rainy summers and drier winters as shown here. And also there is a very strong seasonal temperature changes. It's typical in these temperate grasslands to be fairly warm or hot in the summer, and quite cold in the winter, particularly this winter in the United States, right? In fact, if you pay attention to these temperature graphs, you'll notice that the freezing point, namely 0 degrees centigrade, is in fact marked on all of these. So going below freezing is quite common during the winter in the temperate grasslands, at least for part of the winter. So it's too hot and dry in these particular areas to support forests, and so the plants, not surprisingly, grasses absolutely dominate the landscape here, hence the name grasslands, and also other kinds of non-woody plants. So you don't tend to get large trees. In terms of animals, you get a lot of grazers, things that eat grasses, things like horses and bison. You also get a lot of burrowing mammals, things like prairie dogs and certain kinds of birds and so on. The plants, you can tell just from looking at the picture, the plants are much denser than you see in the desert, meaning much more coverage over the landscape. In the desert, you can sometimes see barren surface of the ground. You typically do not see that in the grasslands. The grasslands are fantastic for agriculture. Why? In part because many of the crops that we grow are in fact grasses. So that is one of the reasons that much of our grasslands have actually been converted to for agricultural purposes to farmlands. So examples of grasses that we eat are things like wheat, corn, barley, millet, oats, rice, sugarcane, sorghum, rye, and other products such as bamboo is also a kind of grass. So there are a lot of products that humans like to rear as part of agriculture that grow very well in grasslands. So they are greatly impacted by agriculture. This is an example of a recent paper on this topic published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences that came out fairly recently. The title is Recent Land Use Change in the Western Corn Belt Threatens the Grasslands and the Wetlands. Since we're talking about the grasslands, we'll just focus on that. So this is one of the figures of the map, is to show you what part of the country we're talking about here. These 5 states here that make up the so-called Western Corn Belt. If you're not familiar with this part of the country, this is North Dakota, South Dakota, Nebraska, Minnesota, and then Iowa down here. So I pulled a quote from this paper, so I'll just go ahead and read that. Temperate grassland is the most altered biome globally. And of course, in part, this is because of its wonderful use in agriculture. And temperate grasslands are the least protected ecosystems in the countries where they occur. In the Corn Belt, nearly all tall grass prairie has been converted to agricultural land uses, whereas conversion of mixed grass prairie exceeds 70%. As a consequence, populations of grassland nesting birds are declining faster than any other group of birds in North America. So the many animals are being negatively impacted by the agriculture going on in the Western Corn Belt. So what this graph actually shows you here is the percent grassland cover, and this was actually dating back even prior to the publication of this picture before 2006, where there was actually yet more conversion of grasslands because of the increasing interest in converting grasslands to soybean and cornfields for use in biofuels. So you can see parts of Minnesota and also Iowa have almost no grasslands whatsoever. So this dark brown means zero zero grassland cover. Okay, let's go on to the next biome here. Temperate forests. Higher precipitation than grasslands. If you look at the precipitation graph, you can see that it is still a bit seasonal, tending to be a bit wetter in the summers, but overall much more rainfall and somewhat less variable. The temperatures are roughly comparable to what we saw in the grasslands, namely warmer in the during the summertime and cooler in the winters, going below freezing. And of course, this would be from the perspective of northern hemisphere. So this is what a typical temperate forest looks like. In this diagram over on the right, it looks a little bit different than a tropical forest, the pictures that we were looking at before. There's still a fair amount of vertical stratification, not quite as much as in a typical tropical forest, not quite as much diversity of plants and animals, although it is still more diverse than, say, the deserts. This is dominated in terms of the plants, dominated by deciduous trees specifically. Deciduous trees meaning those that shed their leaves, that lose their leaves. That's what deciduous means. And so, of course, what we're looking at here is in the middle of summer. If we jump to, say, the fall, this is what a typical temperate forest looks like in the fall. The colors are changing and the trees are about to all lose their leaves for the winter. And if you look at the temperature here, then one of the reasons that there is no huge loss for the plant in terms of reduced photosynthetic activity in the winter because of loss of leaves, well, the temperatures are too low to promote extensive photosynthetic activity anyway, so that is one of the reasons why there is no tremendous loss in having loss of leaves in the winter, as shown in deciduous plants. Okay, next forest biome, the boreal forests. This term here, boreal, means north. And these are now very far north. One thinks of the boreal forest as found on the order of about 60 degrees north, or farther north, slightly farther north. So if this term means north, I mean, we've been discussing how the latitudes have a very strong influence on biomes. And so we've talked about things happening at 30 degrees north and 30 degrees south. So why am I only saying 60 degrees north? What about 60 degrees south? Why do we have an adjective that means north instead of like north and south at 60 degrees? Well, if we go back to the overall global picture of the biomes, we can see why that is. Here's the figure from your textbook, figure 52-9, that shows the distribution of different biomes all over the entire planet. We're talking about boreal forests. Here's 60 degrees north right here, so you can see a whole swath of boreal forests across North America and also Europe and Asia. And where are they at 60 degrees south? Let's check it out. Well, as you run your eyes south, you can see there's not even a little dashed line for 60 degrees south. Let's go ahead and add it in. It would be right here, right? And so as we add it in, we can see why there is no consideration of all these forests at 60 degrees south, because most of the land mass is in fact north of the equator, right? This is where we are at our current state tectonically, right? So if you consider where the equator is, which is this line right here, and look north and look south, it should be pretty obvious to you that most of the land mass on the planet is in fact in the northern hemisphere. Much smaller fraction is in the southern hemisphere, which is why these forests found at 60 degrees are only found in the northern regions. So what can we say about the boreal forests then. Much colder, not a surprise. We're much farther north here, and so if we look at the temperature, you can see that there is a fairly large fraction of the overall entire year where the temperature, the average temperature, is below freezing. Right here's the freezing line right here. So there's just this little period here in the summer where one is above freezing, and the rest of the time it is below freezing. The trees, in terms of plants, the dominant trees, so dominated by what? By cold-tolerant conifers. Okay, plants, trees with cones. What does that sound like? You should be thinking, oh yes, gymnosperms, right? Learned about those, gymnosperms, the cone-bearing plants. And sure enough, there they are. You should recognize them from the pictures with needle-like leaves. And much less precipitation in these forests, much less diversity. These plants, by the way, it's really cold. They tend to be very slow growing and also very long lived. And so when one is in a habitat such as this, these are very, very old trees. They've been growing for an extremely long time, and once they are cut down, it takes a very long time for them to regrow because these trees are in fact extremely slow growing. This is a relatively low productivity area, and it also is fairly low in terms of species diversity. Okay, last biome that we're going to cover, the Arctic tundra. And far north, we're talking about being in the polar regions, so again you should be thinking this is above 66.5 degrees north or south, but usually we think about this just being in the Arctic. Really cold. Again, looking at the temperature, there's hardly any of time at all spent above freezing, just this little period here in the summer. The rest of the time it's really, really cold, below freezing, high winds, and the typical plant communities look as seen in this stunningly beautiful picture here, figure 5216, which is in front of you right now. You can see there are not a lot of tall plants. They tend to be very low to the ground. You see a lot of some grasses, you see mosses. Obviously these are cold-tolerant grasses, cold-tolerant mosses, non-woody plants, small non-woody plants, things like lichens, a few small shrubs and so on, very close to the ground. And in addition, if we consider the ground, one of the phenomena that occurs in the soil is something called permafrost. And this is a name given to a constantly frozen soil layer which occurs below the surface. And so this makes it very difficult then for plant roots to go very deep because they hit this frozen area, this permafrost, and they can't go any farther. So this is the part that never, ever during the year thaws out. So yes, the air temperature is above freezing briefly, which means the very top layer of soil will thaw, but when you go down deeper in the soil, you hit the so-called permafrost layer. So the other thing I'd like to point out before I leave this last biome is that the plant community in the Arctic tundra is really quite similar to those seen at high altitude, meaning high elevation. High elevation, so heading up mountains at all latitudes. So in other words, if one is at a lower latitude but high up, high in elevation, high in altitude, then one can see similar kinds of plant communities because of the similarity in the conditions where it's extremely cold and there's much less precipitation, and one sees plant communities that are very, very similar to this one. Okay, so we've gone through a small sampling of some of the major natural biomes, and your textbook has a nice discussion on the so-called anthropogenic biomes. What does this term mean? This means caused by humans, the same root as in anthropology, the study of humans. And so the so-called anthropogenic biome distribution for at least the eastern half of the United States is shown here in figure 5210, which is in front of you right now on the right-hand side, and I've put figure 52-9 from your textbook on the left, so you can sort of compare what would be there if it hadn't been modified. And so much of what would be natural forests, for example, has been replaced with some biomes which are labeled here: cities and suburbs and villages and various kinds of agricultural other purposes, rangelands and croplands. So just a relatively small fraction of the overall total acreage is still in a natural condition, meaning that it has those characteristics that would be exemplified by the natural biome type. And so what are some of the consequences of this? Well, you can tell just by visiting such places. It probably is not a huge surprise that the overall diversity in plants and animals is much lower in anthropogenic biomes. Not only is the diversity much lower, but the actual plants and animals that exist in such an environment are really quite different. Again, we'll come back to this point when we talk about conservation issues later in the quarter. Okay, that's all we're going to say now about terrestrial biomes. We're going to switch into aquatic biomes, which are much less affected by latitude. But before we do that, since we're leaving the terrestrial biomes where latitude matters, let's go ahead and do this as a quicker question. I told you I'm absolutely holding you responsible for knowing the latitude of where we are, like right now, this very moment. So, what's the latitude, of this room, or of UCI or of Irvine? Go ahead and click in. Hopefully you could do this without even breaking into a sweat. Is it 34 degrees north, 34 degrees southwest, 34 degrees south, 34 degrees west, or 34 degrees northeast? I'm hoping for, 100% accuracy here. I don't know. As you click in, I'll see what you guys think. Okay, has everybody clicked in? Okay. Okay, looks like it's stabilized. Yeah. See what you guys think. Fantastic! But why? Why? We have 16 of you that haven't yet figured out what our latitude is. Or we're maybe confused by the cardinal directions. Latitude will always be either north or south, right? So given that, then you should already be able to cross out all this other stuff, right? Latitude is always north if it's a line north of the equator, and south if it's south of the equator. We're north of the equator, so we're absolutely 35 degrees north. Good job, virtually all of you. So now we'll make our transition to the aquatic biomes. We're going to spend much less time on this. As mentioned before, aquatic biomes are much less affected by latitude. However, aquatic biomes are also very strongly influenced by the chemical and physical environment that makes up that biome. And so examples of chemical and physical attributes are things like temperature, but also salinity. So salinity is a really important part of distinguishing different kinds of large bodies of water. And when we're talking about aquatic biomes, we're talking about large bodies of water. And so salinity, meaning how salty is the water, is really quite different in so-called freshwater systems versus marine systems. And there are some that are somewhere in between. How do we recognize a marine system? Something like an ocean or the sea, the Atlantic, the Pacific. Well, they're really quite salty. Just how salty are they? I do not expect you to memorize this. I'm just using this to give you a better feel for this. And so one can describe it, for example, by percent. So a typical percent of salt in seawater is about 3%. Well, what does that exactly mean? Percent of what? There are various ways of defining percent of what, such as volume or mass. Usually mass is used, mass fraction. And so what that means is if you take a bucket of seawater and you weigh it, and then you get rid of all the water and you weigh it again, the salts will be 3% more or less of the total mass that you weighed before you got rid of all the water. So if it's a kilogram of seawater, you end up with 30 grams of salt. So that's a lot of salt, and the rest of the mass is water. Oceans cover about 75% of the planet's surface, and it should not surprise you to know that there's a disproportionate coverage of oceans in the southern hemisphere, right? After all, we talked about a disproportionate amount of land right now in the northern hemisphere, and so because the northern and southern hemispheres are approximately the same size, then where there's not land, what is there? Well, there's ocean, right? So there's much more ocean than in the southern hemisphere in terms of square area than there is in the northern hemisphere. When we talk about fresh water, there is some salt, but much, much less, usually on the order of less than 0.1%. So more than 99.9% of the total mass is water. One of the extraordinary features about water, one of its interesting properties, is how its density changes with temperature. This is not a graph from your book. I grabbed this from the engineering toolbox. You probably have a graph much like this in your introductory chem textbook. What the x-axis here is temperature in degrees centigrade. So over here on the far left we have 0 degrees centigrade, and over here at the far right we have 100 degrees centigrade. And of course that is the complete range for liquid water, because below that it'll freeze and above that it'll be water vapor. So this is the entire range at which we have liquid water, right? And then on the y-axis here we have density in terms of mass per unit volume. And there's overall a decrease in density with increasing temperature, but there is a maximum at 4 degrees centigrade. So where is that? That's about right here is 4 degrees centigrade, and that's where the maximum is. So at this particular scale, you don't see a huge bump there, but it is in fact a maximum at that temperature, which is very significant in natural bodies of water, because this changes how the water behaves in these natural bodies. So what do I mean by that? Well, because this will make a difference in whether the water columns are stable or not. What do I mean by that? Let's do a little thought experiment. Let's have a beaker and put some water in it, okay? You may be aware that when you have different layers in a liquid, it's stable if we have less dense liquids on top and more dense liquids on the bottom. So something like oil floating on water. Oil is less dense than water, there's less mass per unit volume, so that is a stable situation. So if it's less dense on the top and more dense on the bottom, then we have a stable situation, meaning that the less dense layers can just simply float nicely on top of the more dense layers. Now, if in our beaker of water it's all exactly the same temperature in there because we stirred it up really well, that will be stable as well. Okay, we've got the same density everywhere. It's stable. So let's imagine now that we have a temperature differences with depth in our beaker. This would be a thermocline or a temperature gradient. So if we take an example, going from say 30 degrees to 60 degrees and put this in our beaker. Let's see, if we take the 30-degree water and put this on top, so this is 30 degrees up here, and then we take our 60-degree water and put it down here, will this be stable or not? Well, let's see, 30 degrees, more dense, right? And 60 degrees, less dense. Okay, so this specific example then will be unstable or not stable. What is meant by that? That means if you layered 30-degree water very carefully on top of 60-degree water, it would sink. You would actually see the water then sinking, and the 60-degree water would be rising, the 30 degrees water would be sinking, and this would be self-mixing. It would be not stable. It wouldn't just stay in those stratified layers, right? If we did the reverse, so to do the reverse, I'll first have to erase this. There we are. Get my beaker back. Here we are. Okay, let's get the beaker back here. Now we'll put the 60 degrees. I need to erase one more thing, apparently. There we are. If we now take the 60-degree water and put that on top, and the 30 degrees and put it on the bottom, this would be stable, right? Because we have less dense liquid floating on top of more dense liquid. Okay, that's perfectly stable. Okay, so how does that relate to biomes? Well, in temperate freshwater bodies such as lakes, they show this phenomenon where they mix themselves usually every spring and every autumn. So how does that work? It relates back to whether the layers are stable or not. So let's walk through what is figure 52-20 from your textbook, starting in the winter. So here we are in the winter. It's colder at the top here. In fact, it looks like we've got some ice floating up there. Of course, ice is less dense, but that doesn't really count because of where that's a solid. But if we just look at the liquid underneath, immediately below the ice, a good guess is 0 degrees centigrade. After all, it's being chilled by the overlying ice. And so if we have 4 degrees down here at the bottom and 0 degrees up top, is that going to be stable or not? Well, if we can't remember, we go back to this graph right here and consider that water has a maximum density at 4 degrees, which means if we take this area and blow it up a little bit, it would look like that with our maximum at 4 degrees, which means it's less dense when it's cooler than 4 degrees, right? So this is absolutely stable, right? Little slide there. Then what happens? Spring comes. It's warmed from above, right? The ice melts. As soon as the top waters then start to warm up to the point where they're now less dense, they're going to start sinking. And so as that happens, then one gets mixing and within the lake as a whole. The reason that this is significant is this then helps bring oxygen down into the depths of the lake, and it also circulates nutrients around. So this makes a huge difference in the ability of temperate lakes to sustain life up and down throughout the depth of the lakes. So unstable in leading to mixing then in the spring. Then summer comes and continues to be warm from above. Sun's beating on the on the surface of the lake here. We've also got warmer air, so it's warmer up here and then cooler down there. All right, so as long as it's not cooler than 4 degrees at the very bottom here, then it's going to be stable. So again, it just sits there stably. And then we have one final mixing event in the fall where again, we're moving into fall from the summer. It starts to cool at the surface, and as soon as the cooling is such that we now have, again, less dense layers on top of more dense layers, we're going to have mixing again. So we've got 2 different independent cycles of mixing that occur during the year in temperate lakes, which makes a huge difference. Okay. So let's now consider zones in aquatic biomes. And by the way, I'm not going to take time to go through all the different biomes, nor are you responsible for a lot of the detail in there, but I certainly expect you to know what is meant if somebody says the word of corresponding to one of the aquatic biomes, such as ocean, or lake, or stream, or river, or estuary, or wetlands. I would hope that I would expect you to have an idea of what that actually means. Is it freshwater? Is it saline? Is it moving? Is it not moving? And so on. So I expect you to know it at that level. The terms used to describe zones in lakes and oceans are shown in figures 52-21 and also 22 from your textbook, which I put side by side to facilitate comparison between them. And the first thing I want to reassure you is that you are absolutely not responsible for the specific zone terms that are used to describe, are you closer to the land or farther away from the land. I certainly think there's an important conceptual point that the water that is immediately adjacent to the boundary with the terrestrial environment is more shallow, and it's more affected by the vegetation in the terrestrial area. I think that's important conceptual point and fairly self-evident. I don't think that understanding is facilitated by you memorizing those terms, so you are absolutely not responsible for them. The other terms, though, I think are more mnemonic and more meaningful, and plus, great convenience, they're actually the same terms used in lakes and also in marine systems, and those are these terms right here. The photic zone specifically means that area within the water where there is sufficient light for photosynthesis, hence the name of photic zone. And so this is important because this then, photosynthesis, this is where any kind of photosynthetic organisms have to hang out, or at least part of the time, like while it's light. So photosynthetic plankton, for example, or anything that wants to eat photosynthetic plankton, then this is a good place to hang out. Again, it's the same term in both oceans and in lakes, and then the zone immediately below that is so so deep that insufficient light exists at that location to support photosynthesis is called the aphotic zone. So this is below the photic zone, and it's just too darn dark down there, and that's true in both oceans and in lakes. And obviously the depth at which this occurs will be a function of turbidity, or how many particles are in the water, how clean is the water, and so it can be at varying depths depending on where exactly, where is the lake, where is the ocean. The other term that I'll expect you to know is this one here, the benthic zone, and this is just simply the zone associated with the surface or substrate. Same term used in oceans and lakes. So when one talks about the benthic zone, one is considering organisms that are associated with the substrate, whether it's rocky or sandy. So worms that burrow into a sandy underwater environment, they're part of the benthos, part of the benthic zone. And same with crustaceans running around on the surface of the surface, those would be considered benthic creatures as well. So this refers to organisms that are associated with the substrate at the bottom there. And the only other term that I'd like to point out here is the intertidal. This is another really important term that has actually already been used as we were discussing some of the different kinds of organisms that live in the ocean. This term probably was already used. This is an area that is sometimes submerged, so alternately submerged and exposed with the tides. So the tides come in, this area is underwater, the tides go out, this area is exposed to air. So the kind of organisms that typically live in the intertidal then have to be adapted for being exposed to air or being completely submerged, and you have very specific kinds of organisms in layers up and down the intertidal zone that you don't find anywhere else. Okay, we're going to shift gears now and consider the next topic of behavioral ecology. It sounds like the mic has gotten there. So what's behavioral ecology and how does it relate to the study of behavior? Well, you consider behavior is response to a stimulus. And much, if not most, of the research that is actually done in behavior involves animals, but in fact, behavior can also be used to describe responses to stimuli in other kinds of taxa, such as plants or fungi or microbes, so the term behavior can be used for other non-animal taxa as well. Behavioral ecology is specifically how organisms respond to stimuli in their natural environments, and one of the important things to consider is that behavior is subject to natural selection. So what is meant by that, and how should you then think about this? Hopefully, seeing the phrase natural selection pop up, you're thinking, so if we consider then that there is variation in behavior among individuals, not all individuals behave exactly the same way, and that some of this variation is in fact has a genetic basis and is heritable. Some of this variation is heritable. And certain behaviors will have higher fitness. Right? So that those organisms that have behaviors that are heritable and lead to higher fitness then would be disproportionately represented in subsequent generations, right? They're more likely to by definition, they're more likely then to be genetically represented in the future. And so examples of behaviors that you might think of as fairly obviously related to higher fitness, things like, being able to run away from predators, being able to avoid eating something that's poisonous, right? Those would be behaviors that would be examples that would lead to higher fitness. But something else about behavior is there's a lot of variation in the extent to which it is on the spectrum from sort of innate versus learned, right? Innate behaviors just simply meaning non-learned behaviors. You can think about these as sort of being the equivalent of hardwired behaviors. These are behaviors that are exhibited in the absence of actually learning. And there's also another axis of variability, just how fixed or flexible is the behavior. And this itself, the extent to which a behavior is innate or flexible or fixed or learned, is also under natural selection as well. And so the phrase fixed action patterns is a phrase used to describe specifically a sequence of innate, unlearned, meaning you don't have to learn them, behaviors that once initiated, once started, usually goes to completion. That is, the behavioral sequence is not stopped in the middle, and also it is usually triggered by some kind of external cue. These can be fairly simple behaviors in short sequences, or they can be very complicated behaviors with long sequences. So an example of a fairly complicated behavior with a long duration would be something like certain kinds of migration. Migration patterns can be extremely complicated and long in duration, and many of them have a very large innate and unlearned component to them. So that would be an example. Another example of a fixed action pattern would be something like how certain kinds of fish respond to red colors by attacking them, and that is just something that is innate. That's something that's been studied extensively. I couldn't bear to think of going through this part of the course without giving at least one example of learning. This is kind of a fun example of all the behavioral scientists you've learned about. Dr. Pavlov is probably one that is familiar to you. You've maybe heard about this in the context of a Pavlovian response. So this is a picture of Ivan Pavlov, who won the Nobel Prize. Now, there is no Nobel Prize given in the area of behavior. There is a Nobel Prize given in the area of physiology and medicine, and so many of the notable behaviorists who have in fact won Nobel Prizes, I think I have another minute, yes I do, shh, ended up winning the Nobel Prize in physiology and medicine rather than behavior, and Pavlov was no different. He won the Nobel Prize actually for his work in digestion, but this led him to study behaviors associated with digestion. Okay, now it did click to 3:50, so we'll come back to Pavlovian response on Wednesday. Have a great couple of days, and I'll see you then.